Hello, SmartBear community. I'm welcoming you in SmartBear Talks, where we are discussing exciting and trending topics with software testing experts. Today, we welcome our guest, Robert Schneider from Wise Clouds. Hi, yeah. And we continue talking, we can continue reviewing the API, the most common API testing mistakes. In the previous two videos, we've already reviewed two mistakes. So watch all of them in the current playlist. And today we're going to talk about the interesting topic of collaboration, software testing engineers with end users. So what mistake people usually do here?
Sure. A lot of times, and it's not their fault, the testers are kept far away from the business users, the ones who are actually commissioning the API and the ones who are going to validate ultimately that the API is working. Well, a lot of times we'll go to a customer site for a training class or a consulting engagement, and we'll talk to the testers and say, and the developers sometimes too, by the way, and we'll say, so how much interaction do you have with the users? They say, none or very little. And then I say, well, okay, what about a specification? Do you have a spec on what the API is supposed to do? No. Sometimes they obviously they have, if it's a web service, they have the WSDL, or if it's a REST API, or they might have a Swagger or an Open API document. But a lot of times the users are shielded from the testers and vice versa, and that's a real problem for a lot of different reasons. Probably the biggest one is that the testers are essentially performing quality assurance on something they know very little about. They will look at the API, they'll try to think about what the API might want to do, but they don't really know. And this can be solved quite easily. First of all, why does this happen? That's probably a question you might want to ask. It's not because there's a fear in the users to talking to the testers or things like that, or there's some bad scheme to keep them apart. Many times they're in very different locations. That's a classic reason. A lot of times the testers, in fact, are in an outsourced organization, so they don't really work in the same place as the end users. But truthfully, a lot of those things can be solved by just doing things like what we're doing now, right? Internet communication, set up a Skype call or set up a Zoom meeting or whatever, and talk about what it is that they're trying to achieve.
Okay, so yeah, I know that now many companies do some kind of testing reviews where they are talking with testers in order to understand what they're doing, in order to get the information that can be used. So I think that it can be useful in this case as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of times testers can be shy about asking the users specifically what they want. And sometimes the users don't know, but that's another story for another time, which is kind of a sad thing. But hopefully the users should have some idea about what it is they're trying to achieve with this API that the people are going to be testing. But obviously there are some serious ramifications about doing this. What we see happen when people are separated from their from their end users is they will attempt to guess at what the API is supposed to do. But the way that this manifests is they will very often, instead of writing comprehensive functional tests, they will fall back to the most narrow unit tests that they can do. So they'll say, all right, I don't know what this API does, but I do see that there's a call to look up some order. Let's say it's an e-commerce application, right? I'm going to look up an order using an order ID, and I'll see what it brings back. Great. But what you don't really know, because you're not talking to the users, is that this is part of a much larger process of the preparing the order for shipment, for example, business process. So not only do we have to look up the order, but we have to do some validation of the address and validation of the payment method and validation of the shipper as part of a larger functional test. And if the tester or the developer doesn't even really know that, they're going to pinpoint on each of those steps by themselves with no continuity across the process. And that's not optimal, because you don't really know if things are going to flow very smoothly, if there's going to be connection issues between as you're pulling the data back from one API call and feeding into another. So really you want to be understanding the entire process as best you can, as early as you can in the design phase.
Yeah, so it sounds like in order to create like test scenarios, you'll need to talk with the users, and once you create like yeah, once you create these test scenarios, you can continue. You can start creating tests because you have all this kind of prepared stuff and and you will only need to create tests to cover all these scenarios.
That's right. I mean, part of this also is a lot of times, since you don't speak to the users, not only do you not know what the application or the scenarios that you're supposed to test, you don't know the errors, how errors should be handled. If we're continuing the example of the shipments, what if there's a bad address? What do we do then? What if the shipment is going priority? How do we handle that? If you're only doing unit testing because you don't know what the API is supposed to do, you're going to miss a lot of these nuances. And of course, what's going to happen is when you go to move this into production, because you said it works, you go to move it into production, and the first time it hits a scenario, maybe it's 1 in 100, but if it's a large application, you'll hit that scenario in the first hour of production. You're going to have to go back and reverse engineer what the problem was, and it's going to make you look bad, it's going to make the users unhappy, and it could all be prevented by a brief conversation or periodic brief conversations to truly understand what it is that they want.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Great suggestions. So, community members, do not be afraid of talking with your end users, because you will get a lot of information from them that will help you create wonderful, reliable, and successful tests.
For sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Next time we will review the next mistake. If you have any questions or suggestions about the mistakes, please leave your comments under this video, and we will be happy to continue our conversations online.
All right.
Thanks, Robert, for such a great review. Thank you.
Take care, guys. Bye.
Bye.